So good morning. How are you all today? Good. You responded. That's good. Sometimes it's just nods. And thank you for coming, because day 2 of a conference, sometimes the temptation to be like, I'm going to stay in bed just a little bit longer, right? But if you're like me, I've built an entire career on the little pieces of inspiration and challenge that I picked up in situations like this, where I walk into a session and there's someone who I've never really met, but I feel their authenticity when they present, and I start to believe. And I grab hold of these things that I believe can change my classroom. So how many of you have been keeping a list of things that you want to try or think about or do or follow up on? How many of you have that list in your head? Right? And that's good, because if you have that list, it means you've gotten some things. And you come in and you take that back with you. Right? So whenever I go to present, I know that Beth and I have had these conversations many times. Really what I'm hoping to do is, I love the feeling of giving you something that you can take back that will drive you and inspire you and carry you through all of what we know is a very hard career. And so what we wanted to do today is have a conversation about that, and probably the hardest part of our job, which is the idea of change and innovation. Because innovation being such a positive word for change, and change, like, it just causes stress. So we want to look at that process.
So one of the things, too, is we're having this idea. I know that what we're going to try to share with you is a conversation that we've been having now for months. And so I'm actually really excited about this. I'm about to be the mellow person for the first time ever. This never happened.
You totally set me up. He's the best. It's okay.
It's okay. I'm actually going to be mellow today. Tom's like, oh my God, what have I let these two people do? So we've been talking about this idea of innovation for a long time, and it started with, like, we kept hearing, like, innovation this and innovation that. And, like, there's been books. I've actually read 2 books on innovation in the last couple of weeks to go, I wonder what this thing is. Right? There have been TED Talks on innovation. We've watched a whole bunch of those and said, well, what is this thing? Blog posts. If you go look through, anyone on Twitter, who's on Twitter? And we won't mind that you're multitasking for a minute, but I bet if you just like flip through your Twitter stream, you can find something innovative from the last 24 hours.
Can I throw this out here? If you're here at this particular conference, it's entirely possible that your school perceives you as an innovator and a change agent, which is why you came here, hoping to inspire you and bring you back. How do you feel that pressure to be the innovator from your school? Enjoy that identity. Yeah.
Right. Because you have to go back, and someone's going to say to you, we just sent you to San Diego, we hope this wasn't a boondoggle, and now we want to know, okay, great, what's next?
Now, and then make everyone else that way.
Right. So here's
Right.
This is your job. Don't
You're laughing, but that is literally what happens when I go downstairs to my principal's office. Come on in. How are we innovating now? Right? That's hard.
This is nervous laughter. We get that. We're all nervous right now. This is perfect. So here's what we really want to do. We want to say, what does innovation look like? And we thought about the title about this for a long time, and there'll be a making of a keynote as a documentary another time. What we wanted to be able to do is give you a way to paint a picture. We wanted you to be able to say, we can quantify innovation. And so, as Greg said, right now I'm like deep down the rabbit hole of research mode, but what's been really, really cool about that is innovation's a science. There's science behind it. And so one of the roles that we're going to play, as you hear from the 2 of us, is we're going to look at what's the science behind innovation.
But beyond that, science and the research is one thing. The reality is that we have to have conversations about that research to translate that in the reality of delivering that to our students, whether they be 6-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 17-year-olds. We have to translate that into a real experience for them. So to give you a visual of how this takes place, most of this conversation actually happens in the car while I'm driving home from school. And she reads research and I translate, and we have these bantering arguments back and forth. And that work that happens there is the process of turning science into practical.
So we're going to start with this. We are actually going to define innovation. We're going to stop using it as a buzzword. We're going to come up with a way, again, like I said, we want to be able to measure innovation. And I started looking for a definition about 18 months ago, because I was hearing it over and over again, we got to innovate, we have to innovate. I'm like, what is this innovation you speak of? Like beyond, I guess I know there's a dictionary, and I could have asked Google and all those kinds of things. But I wanted a real definition. And after a lot of research and a lot of reading, I stumbled on this article by an author and a philosopher named Scott Berkun. And the blog article was from 2013. It actually said, please don't use the word innovation. It's like, if you keep saying that everything is innovative, it loses its meaning. But if you have to use the word, this is the best definition that you can use. So we're going to use this as a definition, that innovation is significant positive change. Let's say we're going to measure this. So Scott Berkun further went down and he said, okay, let's break this down. What is significant? And he said, very broadly, significant is greater than 30%. So you have more than 30%, you have something that's significant.
So think about what that means for you. If we're talking about making significant positive change, and we apply that rather vague definition of what significant is, imagine if you were to just randomly drop 30% change on your classroom, or 30% change in your school. So we acknowledge that that's a process, and that we're going to work, but it can be done.
And at the same time, that's really kind of comforting, because that's just like, yes, there's a big part of it, but 30% is actually bigger than you might think. So that means this, there's 30% that doesn't have to change. Like, not everything has to be innovated. There's a one innovated, there we go. I have a degree, innovated, here we go.
But you know what?
I'm from Atlanta originally, I'm just going to blame my region.
But it also, and maybe this is something you convey to your teachers, is that it means that there's some foundational things that you do, and the identity of your classroom gets to significantly stay the same within all of that change.
Because there's a lot of things that have worked really, really well in education for hundreds of thousands of years, and we're not saying, okay, let's throw everything out. And I think that comes down to where the next piece of this definition, which is what is positive. So now, here's my first question. Does anybody know what that is? Who knows what it is? Anyone? Guys, what is it? It's the bacon bowl. You can actually buy one. So, I was, again, I'm searching for this definition of innovation, and I did a, I'll admit it, not very good Google search, where I typed in, like, innovative products. And
this came up.
And this is what came up, the bacon bowl.
Now, mind you, she's also pitching this as a slide in this presentation. I'm like, don't do bacon. Don't do bacon. Please don't do bacon. We did bacon.
We did bacon. But here's the thing. So the bacon bowl, it actually looks like an upside-down muffin tin. You wrap bacon around it, you bake it, and now you can eat your food out of a bowl made of bacon. Now, Scott Berkun did argue that not all inventions are innovative. I would call this inventive. So we're going to come back to this definition. We want something that's significant, but we also want something that's positive, and I will leave you to interpret whether or not you find the bacon bowl to be a positive, significant change.
For some of you, you're like, yes. Yes, it is.
I'm on the fence, I gotta say.
So I want to do this. Let's just talk about our experiences. No matter how long you've been in teaching, change comes pretty quick. So just ask yourself, and maybe share with the person next to you, what's the most significant positive change you've ever experienced in your career?
Say hello, say good morning.
Positive.
Positive. Positive.
It was actually kind of nice to feel like the pleasant lightness of people's conversations. It was positive. Can you imagine how different that discussion would have been if I had just said change? If we had just said, what's the biggest change you've experienced? Right? Because we have this sense that there are changes that come that are sometimes hard on us. Right? But let's talk about this. We're talking about positive change. Let's go to the next step behind this. If we want to know how it happens, now I want you to take a moment and share with the person next to you, who or what was it that inspired that change in your classroom? What drove the change that you experienced? Talk about these things. That change was someone who mattered a lot. Right? An inspirational teacher. See, when I think about that, I think about a team. Well, the bigger story is probably this. I have as one of my most prized possessions, and my children know it, this backpack where I put every single letter I've ever received that thanks me or says you've inspired me. You know, it's like my soul backpack. And you have those days where teaching is hard, and you come down, you read it, you're like, I'm going back, and it's going to be okay. And in there is one that doesn't make sense to anyone except me. It's an email from my principal, a person who's only my principal for 1 year, Jean Bowen. And she sent me an email that said, it's deeply touching, come to my office. Please. Right? So, if you've all been teaching, so, right? And I was like, oh God, now you need to know that it was the first year that I was working with her, and the only year that I was working with her. We were opening a brand new school, and I came in and I was told, we want you to try new things. And so I was doing this radical and subversive thing where I was using cell phones every single day. And I figured I've just got to go with it and try it. And I got the email, and I knew it was like, this is my comeuppance. You're going to pay, be prepared, but let's be honest. So I walked in, I sat down, and she said, hey, how you doing? Like, small talk. And I said, okay, what's this about these cell phones? I said, well, here's what I've been doing. She said, I want you to use them as much as possible. Go crazy. All the rules don't apply to your classroom. And I was like, because I wasn't really expecting that. I was expecting to get reined in. She's like, listen, we can't fight this right now. Teachers are furious about this, and we're not going to win. And we're either going to learn how to use this tool and find a way, or we're going to be incredibly frustrated professionally. And I just let it go. And this is before iPads or iPhones. This is just like the Nokia green lighted text messaging tool. But I had free reign to do it, and we found incredible ways to use that in the classroom. When I think about the barrier that she removed, right? I had a belief, right? And she gave me permission to alter the environment that my students came to every single day. And we altered the what could happen and what they did, and we altered their experience in the classroom drastically by connecting to the outside world. And for me, that was the beginning. Come to the office.
Come to the office. And it might be that when we start thinking about how are we going to start innovating our classrooms and schools, it could actually start with something as simple as come have a seat. I usually didn't get a please. We have different principles.
That's what I want.
Is that what it is? Okay. So one of the things that we want to do is when we think about this idea of innovation, we've said it's significant positive change. So what are we actually changing? So here's what we want to do. We're going to break this idea of change down into bits and pieces. And we're going to look at it in 3 ways. And we can actually know, and this was what's really nice, that our definition of what we want to break down can actually go back to the mid-1900s. So there's a social psychologist by the name of Albert Bandura. And Albert Bandura, around it's like 1925-ish, started writing about this idea. He called it social cognitive theory. That was the first one. Social cognitive theory. And here's what it comes down to. He says, when we look at how students are learning, we have to look at this interplay, this relationship between their environment, the behaviors that they're doing in that environment, and their beliefs. And when we think about what learning is, it's this measurable change in behavior and beliefs. But we can't isolate it. So one of the things we started, Sean and I were talking back and forth, and we started developing this vision, like maybe innovation's like a three-legged stool. Like for the stool to be able to stand up, we've got to have all three components. We have to talk about the environment, we have to talk about the behaviors, and we have to talk about the beliefs. Now, the most obvious one, like the easy one to talk about it, and we've already been talking about it at length, is environment. I mean, look around right now. If we were to take a little like time machine, we should play some Back to the Future music. Like if we did a Back to the Future, we go back in time, go back 20 years. How many of you really thought that we would have iPads and Chromebooks and smartphones and laptops in the classroom? Right? Oh, true confession. I wrote a paper in college about why email would never succeed as a form of communication, and I typed it on a typewriter.
Innovation.
Innovation right here. I was not correct.
So,
I wasn't correct. Good.
but that leads us to ask this question. Like, if we had gone back in 2009 and said, what does the future look like? I don't know that we would have predicted this. You guys realize that the iPad only was invented in 2010. Right? And now we have this idea that of schools that is completely altered. They're saying that at some point in the next, by 2019, it's going to be 90% of schools will be one-to-one at some level, or have regular daily access to one-to-one technology.
Right. And then here's the thing. Like, we're seeing the environment change. We're seeing the maker spaces. We're seeing the technology. We're seeing the learning commons. We're changing this environment, and yet we're all asking, well, wait a minute. I'm like 4 years into my one-to-one program, or I'm 2 years into my one-to-one program, and like something's not right. Like for some reason, everything still looks the same.
So if we wanted to look at something, I think the archetype for imagining the future for me will always and forever be the Jetsons. And they reimagine every aspect of life. If you think about the Jetsons, I remember watching that they would like the flying car would come and drop them off at work, and then it would fly back home on its own. I remember them walking in, and the machine that like changes hairstyles, right? Or they'd go through something like the clothes would just change.
But they always wore the same thing.
They always wore the same thing. So we'll get back to the Jetsons in a second. But we kind of do that when it comes to reimagining classrooms. But what's funny is if you Google classroom of the future, what you end up with is pictures like this. And if you look, it has an amazingly incredible, intense technology chalkboard with students still sitting in rows, with different tablets, all facing the teacher who is ready at a moment's notice to provide them with knowledge in the same model that has existed forever. And if you look at ones that look further into the future, here's yet another even higher tech hologrammy version of a hologrammy chalkboard with the same hologrammy screens with all the students still facing the teacher, waiting for that teacher to deliver some very important content.
And they're hologrammed in.
Right? Like they're not even there. It's virtual.
This is not hard to find.
So you might be saying, okay, let's go back to our archetype of imagining the future. How might the Jetsons have imagined that the classroom of the future might be? Remember, they put screens on their toasters, and this is how they saw schools.
Well, so they had this whole problem, right? They were like,
okay, well, let's start with this. Why are we so stuck in our sameness?
Too much technology.
We both tap the remote at the same time.
I didn't touch anything.
I'm not taking the blame. It's you. Hey, can I just say this? You want to talk about innovation? You can teach for 21 years and co-teach. You put 2 teachers in front of a room, and it becomes this incredibly difficult thing to be able to speak and do a job that you've done every day for your whole life. And that's not that very far away from the models that we're used to, right? So let's talk about this. Why are we so stuck in our sameness?
I'm going to be the calm one here. He's so excited about this. But we're having this discussion. The good news is that we can actually have an answer. So there was a great book that was written in 1995. So think about this. 1995 by David Tyack and Larry Cuban. And it was called Tinkering Toward Utopia. And in this book, they talk about the whole history of education reform. It's a great read. It's actually like a really good read. And they talk about this. They say, what we're stuck in is the grammar of school. We have this grammar of school. And how many of you have ever been to school before?
A lot.
How many of you know somebody who's been to school before? How many of you can go back a couple of generations and know somebody that went to school at some point in time in their lives? We have this grammar of school that is so completely entrenched globally in our minds that we really can't break it. So here's the thing with the Jetsons. We're coming back to this. Again, we have a group of creative individuals, like super creative individuals. They can envision flying cars, they can colonize outer space, right? And then they decided to envision school.
And this is what they came up
And
with.
this is what we got. The toaster can talk and determine how to make school and or bake toast, and the best thing that they can come up with is a grumpy robot and chalk.
You've been replaced, and the chairs are much more comfortable.
Oh, and the grade scale goes to H.
Yeah, there
You
you
can
go.
get an H now. So here's the challenge. Like, we have taken our vision and we're still trying to project it forward. Like, we cannot break this grammar of school.
So, think about this. Name any other profession where before you spend your first day in the classroom, you spend 17 years watching a model of that job over and over and over again before you teach your first lesson. How many of you have taught in your classroom for longer than you sat in a classroom as a student? Right? And even then people's hands are like, I don't want to raise my hand. Like, that's a lot. Right? That's a powerful mindset to have watched and seen it away, and then be placed in the role where you have to determine what that way should be.
So here's where we're going to really start to have a challenge, right? Because now when we think about what is this positive change, one of the first changes that we have to break is this environment. So what we have to think about is how do we stop the first 17 years that you've spent in school
And prevent them from making us invent a better next 17 years that you'll spend in school. That's weighty. It's not so easy as making one choice to change it. Because if you drastically change that model, you're doing it against thousands of experiences and years of knowing how we think that it should be. So for me, if I have to go back and look at a model for like the biggest, most significant change that happened in my classroom, I'd have to go back to when we rolled out one-to-one iPads. And in the years prior to that, I saw that these tools could be powerful, but I didn't possess the tools. I just aspired to have them. And I really didn't even know what I was going to do when I got them. How many of you have been in this situation? The superintendent came to me and said, what would you do if you had iPads in the classroom? And I was like, I would do so many amazing, I would change, it would be, oh my gosh. Like I would love, and then when I got them, I realized that they handed me iPads, and there's a picture in the newspaper. This is one of my greatest shames as a teacher. And it's the first day of iPads being rolled out, and all my students walked into the classroom, and then every administrator in the school walked into the first classroom that was going to get iPads, followed by 3 reporters from the local newspapers. So on a day where I know what to do, meet my students, tell them who I am, ask who they are, tell them what I'm going to have them do, with the room bedecked in all kinds of inspiration, I had done none of that because I thought that the environment would be dictated by this device. And what I came to realize is that in the absence of knowing what to do, we tend to use technology to replicate old patterns. We do what we used to do. That's a very expensive notebook. We use it to organize. And what I found was that I needed an idea. I needed to believe in what they could do differently for my students. And over time, I developed that. And really, another significant part of this experience is I just blogged. With no one listening, I threw out what I was doing. And as people started to see what I was trying, we started having conversations, and now I have an idea of what I can do. That device for me is a voice for the voiceless. It's a conveyance for learning. It's gravity on every act of learning that we have. Expressions of learning explode beyond my classroom, and I'm passionate about the fact that I have to get what they are doing and learning out. But then I had another interesting experience, and I'd be interested if anyone else has had this. After converting our entire district to iPads, I was offered a new job. And I took it. And I went to a school that was not one-to-one. And I was terrified. Every time I thought to do a lesson, I had this idea that involved the tool. And every time I tried to process what could happen in my classroom, it was trumped in my mind by not having that tool. And that was a problem for about exactly 6 weeks. Because what I realized then, what's that?
You complained longer than that.
It was a little more. Okay, let's be honest.
But the thing is as someone who was like halfway across the country, like he's gone into this environment, he had so many ideas, we were talking all the time, like, Sean, what are you doing in your class? Sean, what are you doing in his class? And he took this new job, he was so excited about it, and you were like 2 or 3 months in, and I'm like, so, Sean, haven't heard from you in a while.
And
what's going on?
well, because I was used to speaking in technology, not in practice. And that's where maybe another significant learning moment happened. What really changed my classroom was never the devices. What really changed my classroom was a belief that altered my environment and changed learning behavior. And the learning behaviors and the way that we express lessons could stay the same. And I realized that my classroom did not revert back. Losing the tool did not alter the environment back to what it was before, because what was in place, what is way more powerful than the device, which is the belief in what learning can be, and what learning behaviors truly alter, change, and create active learners, right? So then when I finally got those devices back, it wasn't the dramatic change that I thought. It wasn't going one-to-one again. We already crossed that threshold.
So now, this is where we have a new challenge. How do we ensure the survival of an innovative species? How do we think about how we can make sure that this change can actually happen? So now we're going to take another flashback into history. We're going to go back to 1996, and we're going to go to Wisconsin. Anyone from Wisconsin? Yeah. Sweet. Okay, so we're going to go back to Wisconsin, and Wisconsin in 1996 was having 2 major ecological problems. So the first ecological problem was this. There were zebra mussels invading the Great Lakes. Now, we looked up what a picture of a zebra mussel is, and we were told it looked gross.
We cannot show that to you. It's disgusting.
We went with zebra stripes.
Symbolism.
So, the zebra mussel is invading. Now, at the same time, there was this second invasive species, computers. Computers were invading the ecosystem of school. So 2 researchers, Yang Zhao and Kenneth Frank, they got together and they started this study, and they said, what if we looked at this invasion of computer species just like we look at these zebra mussels? And so they set up a 5-year study. And in this 5-year study, they looked at 19 different elementary schools spread out over 4 districts across Wisconsin. And they said, let's take a look at what happens when we allow these computers to start invading the ecosystem of schools. And let's think about how we can take this model and really situate it in science. Because at the same time, there's all these biologists going, all right, what are we going to do about these really gross, slimy-looking zebra mussels? So now, the first thing happened. As they looked at their, 5 years of research, we're talking hundreds of teachers, thousands of students, 5 years of research, the first thing they started to see was this. There was this adoption. And so these invasive species come in, these computers come in, and the first pattern was this adoption, where they saw that teachers were so willing to use these computers when it made an administrative task easier. And if it meant filing attendance faster, they were totally on board. If it made typing up report cards easier, no problem. Anything that made their jobs more efficient, those teachers were going to adopt it. But here's the thing. They realized that the only people starting to adopt those species, for the most part at that time, was the teachers using them for administrative tasks. So they looked a little bit deeper, and they realized something. If this invasive species has absolutely no impact, if it's not making this significant change on their practice, on their teacher behaviors, on their beliefs, then it wasn't actually going to get used by the students. So there's this adoption period of how these things are coming in. But they dug a little deeper and they kept looking at all of the data, and then they realized there was an adaptation, or an adaptation. So they started saying, well, hang on, for the most part, we're seeing these species come in, and they go and they interview these teachers, and they go, do you use the computer? Teacher goes, oh yeah, all the time. And they go, great, what do you do with it? They're like, I learned email. But then they started finding some other teachers, and they're like, are you using them? And they're like, yeah, these things are awesome. I'm using them with my students. My students are starting to have these great opportunities. And they went, what's changing? Why are some of these teachers really starting to use these computers? And we're talking desktops, right? This is like 1998. I had a Power Mac in 1998. Couldn't print. That was why I was using that typewriter. They're like, what is this one big difference? And they were finding that teachers who were using computers in their personal lives were more likely to be using them with students. And so going back to this idea of the zebra mussel, there was a point, they had a point, I was wondering where they were going with that first as well. They're like, teachers that are using these computers in their personal lives, they're starting to adapt. It's like evolution. There's an adaptation that's going on. And if the teachers are starting to change their behaviors in their personal lives, they're starting to get this belief like, well, what if we let the students start to change their behaviors and how it might impact their learning? So then what happened was this. They were like, okay, there's evolution. Now here's the good news. How many of you use a device in your personal lives?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. You have already entered the evolution.
We're on our way.
We're there. We're still going there.
But even more than that, can you imagine now, imagine a first-year teacher starting off on their journey, or maybe a student teacher coming into your classroom, and you finding that they're not someone who's ready to adapt rapidly, right? Think about, for how long was the chalkboard like the conveyance in the classroom? How long did that run its course? And now we look at digital technology. How many of you believe that in 10 years it'll be the iPad and the Chromebook that are the tool and the device that our students are using? How rapidly does just the interface on those devices change? Right? So adaptation is huge. And I, as someone who has to do hiring now, one of the key things I'm looking for is that ability to be adaptable, to adapt to the rapidly changing world that we live in.
But here's the other piece too. So remember, we've got this ecosystem model. And if anyone wants to look up the article, it's a very complex diagram. Because you've got those teachers that are starting to evolve, and so they're now starting to change the environment. You've got those teachers that haven't started evolving, and they're becoming kind of like barnacles on a post somewhere. And then
you just call them barnacles. Okay.
Okay. So I guess
Shh, don't repeat that part.
Yeah. So what ends up happening is now your environment's starting to change, but then we have to ask this question as well. With this adaptation, with this ecosystem, the researchers also started looking at like what's the environment that allows the pedagogies to take hold? That just like Sean talked about his principle earlier, how do we make sure that we can allow these changes to happen? Where's our administrators in the room? Oh good, there's a lot of you. This is your job. You're like the ecosystem gatekeeper.
That's not funny. That's hard.
That's hard. Like we have to make sure, right, that there's a school community and that we've got administrators and teachers and colleagues and that we're really trying to make sure that we're supporting this growth and we're not squashing it. I think there's still zebra mussels in the Great Lakes. Like they've invaded, they're there. And the ecosystem's actually allowing them to happen.
So kind of what we have to keep in mind is this. What is the significant change that we want to see? To direct the process, we have to know what's the significant change that we're looking for.
And this change, I mean, we've already said, it's got to be more than the devices. It has to be more than just the fact that we're changing this environment. And as the researchers in Wisconsin started pointing out, it's about how are we starting to change these behaviors. You know, it's more than furniture, it's more than makerspaces, it's more than iPads, it's more than Chromebooks. You know, again, ultimately what we want to start thinking about is how do we change these behaviors? So Al in November yesterday started to hint at it. He's like, how do we make sure that we're building this group, that we're building this whole set of new students that are critical thinkers? Tony Wagner, who's a researcher and a professor at Harvard, has a great book about creating innovators. And there's the Most Likely to Succeed movie that's out right now, and they talk about all of these wonderful traits about how we're starting to build these innovators. And what Tony Wagner says in his book, he's like, it's not what students know, it's what students do with what they know. It's what the students are starting to do. This is where we want to be really looking at the second leg on that stool. So we have to think about how are we deep down starting to change the relationship of what we mean by learning. How do we change it so we make sure that it's the students that are doing the really, really hard work? And I'll give you another research article. So it's Alexander and Schaller. And it was written back in the, now I can't quote myself completely, but it was like 2001. And they said, learning is measurable change. That's how we can quantify learning. Learning is measurable change. So from a cognitive perspective, here's how we know it. But, and this is the really hard part, because they have 9 principles of learning. And principle number 3 is this. Learning can be resisted. We can resist learning. And I bet we can think about this with these behaviors. We want this learning to happen, we want this measurable change to happen, but we also know that it can be resisted. Because how many times have you had to learn something new that is completely against everything you already knew? All of a sudden, you have to change everything that you already knew. So at that point, that learning can be resisted. That's where we are right now. We want our students to change the behaviors. Think about it. How many of your students, wait, where's the kindergarten teachers? Oh, okay. Hey, kindergarten, how excited are your kids when they come in the room to learn something new? Like, you have the best job ever. They're actually still excited. Where are my high school senior teachers?
Let's bring it back to like that moment for kindergarten. When I learned how to write my name, I remember jumping off the bus, holding my name on paper, raising like, my name! And I wrote it everywhere, right?
So somewhere between kindergarten and 12th grade, they even started to realize they became enculturated into that old grammar of school. They were waiting for us to give them the information. You know, they're going to learn to be quiet and sit down and listen. They're going to learn to take notes. We're going to push this content out. But now, it's not just what they know, but what they do. That's hard for our students. It's as hard for our students as it is for all of us as teachers. This is the hard part, and honestly, this is a pretty terrifying part.
And what we're talking about is the altering of environments. And the way that I like to frame to my teachers how our classrooms has changed is that we now live in a new, abundant economy of information. Okay? And I'm gonna say this. For me, this was very, very hard because I worked really hard to be an entertaining lecturer. How many of you ever received very good advice from some excellent teachers about the best way to be an exciting, dynamic, and engaging lecturer?
My first year teaching English, I knew everything I needed to know from Deaf Poet Society. I had it nailed.
You stood on that desk.
Absolutely, yes.
So let's just say this. All that work that I did to be that dynamic and engaging lecturer, one day I had the realization that there were lessons that I was good at, that I loved, that my kids enjoyed, that I would never do again. And that felt like, at some level, throwing away a little piece of me, right? So this is an existential thing that we're going to talk about, because it talks about the nature and role of a teacher in a world where information is everywhere. So this is that traditional model, right? And we could get into long discussions about what that means, but it's essentially this. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, the teacher stood in front of class, and they possessed knowledge, lots of ideas. And their job, and what made them good, is to possess and distribute as many of those ideas in a way that was sticky enough that they stuck to the students. And they used what they had, the chalkboard, to present those ideas. And the student's job was to absolutely, under no circumstances, interfere with the effective delivery of that information to everyone in the room. And it made sense that the students had to be quiet because another student, like standing up and saying something, interfered with the others in the classroom gaining that knowledge, which could only be gained from the teacher. Where else were you going to get the information? And we live in a world with Even now, most of us have like libraries, but in a time before that, when the American educational system was being created, you couldn't even do that. There was simply no place to go. This person was unique in their environment, essential to its operation, doing something that no one could imagine changing. But today, it's a little bit different.
Because today I can go, okay, Google. How many of you have done that? Just do it, right? Okay, Google. Hey, Siri. Here's what I need to know. Driving me nuts sometimes. Watching television with my husband, I'll ask him a question, he'll pull his phone out and be like, Siri? Sometimes I go, I'm here. And I have an answer.
How many have the pause button on your TV? And now, in between, you're like, I gotta check that. You pause, and you're like, you Google it. How many of you watch TV with your iPad or device or computer because you can't wait to find out things? Yeah, we had to ban it in my house because we all did it.
Or you know, those people that actually watch the whole thing up front, they tell you the ending. But so here's
Our whole life is pop-up video now. Or like, remember pop-up music video? Every day is that. Right?
So we now have pop-up education, right? Like our students are now bringing into the classroom the most powerful tool that they have ever had to take to school with them, right? They are now bringing with them, they have an entire global library in their pockets every single day. We'll go back to the Jetsons for a second. Elroy Jetson, you know the little one? Just spent too much time studying the Jetsons. But Elroy actually... So it's really kind of fun. It's all on YouTube. So Elroy Jetson actually had a homework helper, right? So again, we can have a computerized homework helper, and when Elroy didn't know how to do something, he could just ask it. Gee, kind of like Wolfram Alpha. Kind of like Google, right? So now we have our students. They have a homework helper in their pocket. They have a professor in their pocket. They have Khan Academy in their pocket, which, by the way, is really good when you're trying to learn stuff that's hard, right? Because you can pause the teacher. I'm sure some of you right now would like to either mute us or slow us down.
Or imagine if your students could pause you when you're talking, like, oh, pause. What would the flow of your classroom be like? But you can do that in reality in alternate settings.
Right. So now we have to ask this question, like, how are our teachers going to respond to our students in this new environment? Again, we're talking about how are we now going to change this behavior?
Right. So imagine in a Google world where you can get all this information, trying to be the person sitting in front of the room, acting in the role that you're in. And this is where this becomes existential, right? One of the things I have on my Twitter account is this statement that I've said since I started teaching. Like, teaching is who I am, not just what I do. Right? This is me. It's my identity. Altering that can hurt. But if I try to be the font of knowledge, I also tend to devalue myself because they can get that somewhere else. In fact, the problem is they can get too much information. And here is where we can find a way to redefine what teaching in this new abundant economy of information can be. So here is the model that works best for me, and I hope will kind of help represent to you what we can make education become. The teacher as a conductor. So if you've ever, anybody here a music person? And have you ever seen really good conductors when they're conducting an orchestra? They don't play a single note. They don't play a single instrument. And oftentimes they do what they're doing almost with their eyes closed. But they can hear everything that's going on within that classroom, within that symphony. And they can raise the volume of some notes, diminish other notes that are getting in the way. And in the end, they can craft for themselves this beautiful symphony where all of the work, all of the learning, all of the expressions are coming from outside of themselves, but they are integral in order to make that expression something that's meaningful to everyone and not just massive noise. The difference is the warm-up before the symphony and the actual elite symphony playing something absolutely beautiful. That is our role. So here we have the conductor, the class coming in with ideas, and then using those, and then the conductor weaves them together into a tapestry of learning that's meaningful to the entire class, where the innovation of one child is conveyed to the 5 in a different group, where the stations where they're working come up with something unique and we help them, where we remove barriers, where we stop the one kid who might be doing something that's going to get in the way of the process and just pause them for just a second. Teacher as conductor in a new abundant economy of information.
So what's this look like?
Okay, so That was really good.
You
I was like, how am I going to transition this? Well done.
Well, yeah, really. Now let's come here now. Let's come back. Your job is reality in this
Right.
film, remember?
Okay, and so here's the other part of this. How many of you, when somebody asks you what you're teaching, love what you're doing so much that you could be going off? So I worked really hard, right? I love what I do with all my heart. And this unit that I did is just a regular unit. So I'm not trying to say it's like dramatically unique from what people are doing, but the way that I envision it and the mindset of me as conductor is something that's hard. So I teach a class of international studies, and one of the reasons I took it is because it has no framework. We have so much freedom. And in this class where I'm teaching international studies, we got to the end where we've built skills throughout. And the end unit is a case study. And here is how the case study is organized. You pick a topic, and that's what we do. Which is good, except for me as a teacher, I have the 17-year echo of being in class in all of my college classes, driving me to do the one thing that I have viewed thousands of times, which is do the research, present the information, let everyone drink in my knowledge. And the other thing is, that feels right. And you have to turn off that voice inside of yourself and allow the students to do something different. So what we did is this, and to try to essentialize this process and prevent me from going off into an abyss of all the awesomeness, right?
Yeah.
We did the ISIS project. And the key to this is me assuming the role of orchestra conductor. And so I asked all of my students, what is the best way for us to learn about ISIS? And one of my students said, let's watch a movie. And I said, okay. And I came back and I said, I've got 3. Which one do you want to watch? And they voted, and they picked a movie. And we watched that movie. And all I did was give them a framework, not a worksheet, a graphic organizer. And on it it said, what is the most important part of this film? What is it that we don't know that we need to know? Right? And what is the best way to share this knowledge with the world? And they went through and watched this video with these ideas. I need to know what's missing. The end result of that was that when we were done, we knew things, but there were so many questions. And we took time to just generate and throw those questions out. My job was collector, to write them down, and maybe to help a person who couldn't phrase the question properly get the question more thoroughly on the board. Then when that happened, those questions became a commodity for learning. And think about what happens when you present students with questions. Here are my questions. Is that cheers or groans? But when it's their questions, it's different. I said, okay, we're going to research these questions. And they started fighting over the questions. I literally had to institute a draft whereby the group that picked first, we would then go through all of the groups picking questions, then rotate back. So if you went first, you got the best. And at the end, the worst question. What this did is created an economy where we learned that how you ask the question matters a lot. And that there are good questions and bad questions. Then we said, what are we going to do? We're going to do research. We're going to do research. My job was not to give them the resources. My job was to say, here's how you search in Google. Here's what advanced search can be. To sit back and ask, how is it going? Why is that hard? Not the content, but the process. And then after that, to ask them, how are we going to share it? You got this information, how are we going to share it? And they went with something that's completely comfortable to them, because it happens in most of their classrooms, presentations. Every group created a presentation. And then we said, how are you going to share it? And they said, we don't want to do the whole class. Let's do small groups. We wagon wheeled around. Each group presented to the other group discussing their answers. So they were presenting them again and again and again for several days in class. And then we had to say, what's the best way for us to get this information out? And they spoke in like the genius in the room was like, we wanted to watch a video. Let's make a video. But then this horrible tragedy happened. We ran out of time. And it's a semester class. And I promised them that if they made a video, I would get them 1,000 views, right? But then class ended. The beautiful thing is that because it was their process, their goal, and their objective, my students have been coming in for the past 2 weeks to work on our video after class. The grades have been given, right? But the mission isn't over. And now I have today a group of students who went to our production studio with Wildcat Productions, and they're working with my class to finish our video so we can put it out. My goal is to play it for you now, look how awesome this is. But I think the story without it might be better. Authentic, meaningful, engaging activities they don't want to put down.
So let's take a look at this again. And so Sean, in a lot of ways, has walked us through, like, here's your reality, here's what these behaviors can look like. But we recognize something again. You have to leave here and have something tangible, right?
You have the list.
You have to have the list. And as I promised you, there is a science of innovation. And so what we want to make sure that we do is when you go back and you have to talk to your colleagues and you have to talk to your administrators, we want to give you some proof. Or at least I did. I read it. I want to share it. So we want to give you some proof. And so I've got a little historical timeline. And we're going to go back to pretty much like, we'll start our timeline of innovation at like the crash of the .com. Doesn't that seem like a good time to start? So we're going to start the crash. And we're going to go back to 2001. And I mentioned Larry Cuban earlier. You know, 1995, Larry Cuban wrote about education reform and about this idea of tinkering toward utopia. And then in 1996, he actually started looking around. Now, Larry Cuban's a professor at Stanford. So think about it, he's Stanford. He is in the heart of Silicon Valley. And so he starts doing research in schools in Silicon Valley, right? So we're thinking if there's going to be crazy technology, innovation, awesomeness, we're going to see it in Silicon Valley, right? So he starts researching these schools. And in 2001, he wrote a book. This is like, you're thinking, right? This is going to be the seminal book coming out. And here's what it was called: Oversold and Underused. Computers in the classroom. Because what he found was the exact same thing in Silicon Valley as Yang Zhao and Kenneth Frank found in Wisconsin. That these computers are coming in high access, low use. Anyone else seen that before? Lots of access, not a lot of use. So one of the things he saw, he did see that administrative tasks. Sure, I can check my email, like I'm using this for administrative tasks. And then he did start seeing some teachers using this technology with their students. And guess what their students were doing? Typing practice. Some basic word processing, maybe some presentations. So they're starting to use it, but it was really, really low level, and it was so rare. Now, skeptic in the crowd, thinking to themselves, well, you know, that was 2001, like it was really early, right? That's a long time. I mean, 2001, it wasn't that long ago, but like that feels really, really early. So now, 2010, Charlotte-Mecklenburg School District. Anyone from Charlotte-Mecklenburg? Sweet, all right. Impacting study in 2010 with Amy Overby. Did you know there was an impacting study in 2010 with Amy Overby? Guess what? One of the largest studies that has been recorded right now, huge empirical study. They did several years of data, right? And they wanted to ask this question. We're seeing this high access, low use. What would be the predictor of teachers really starting to use technology with their students in really powerful ways? So again, they looked at hundreds of teachers. They looked at thousands of students. And when they went through their entire initial analysis, what they found was this. The teachers who believed in student-centered, active learning were more likely to use technology with their students than those who didn't have that belief. They kept digging. They were saying that teachers who genuinely believed that the technology would support their students in that behavior of being the ones to be actively involved in the learning process, those were the teachers who were going to use it. And then they looked at it again, and they were like, well, hang on a second. How come in some schools this is happening, and in some schools it's not happening, right? What's the difference? And the single greatest predictor of whether or not your school had innovative teachers, where are my administrators again? Okay, you have the hardest job right now. The key predictor there was if the administrators believed that students should be involved in student-centered active learning, then the teachers would believe that the students should be involved in student-centered active learning, and guess what? They started using the technology in really powerful ways. And so we have this amazing study after 3 years. So 3 years of data, and there was a lot of data, and there was a lot of statistics, and I kind of skipped parts of that. There was N's, and it was a really large sample size. They came down to say this: the single most practical predictor, the most important predictor of significant positive change was whether or not the teacher believed in it. Forget about the technology for a minute. And it's not the other way around. that technology doesn't make the belief. The belief comes first. So now, there's another really interesting study. Yesterday, Alan November mentioned a great educator named Kathy Cassidy. And Kathy Cassidy was actually part of this study in 2012 with a researcher named Peggy Erber. And Peggy Erber and another team of researchers got together, and they looked through all of the teachers who'd ever won any type of innovative award, the teachers who had all kinds of certifications, teachers who were blogging, teachers who were on social media, and they looked all the way across North America, and they pulled together a sample of 15 teachers that they thought, K-12, who are the most innovative teachers that we can pull together? And they interviewed them, and they surveyed them, and they looked at their blogs and their websites and everything else. And they wanted to know, what's the one thing that all of these teachers have in common? And the one thing that all of these teachers had in common was a belief in student-centered active learning. They felt that the students needed to own the process. And then the next thing that was really interesting about that was they said to all of these amazing, innovative educators, they said, well, does everyone in your school do this? Does everyone in your school on board? So why do you think that everybody in school is not on board? And the number one answer, it had nothing to do with the Wi-Fi, it had nothing to do with the age of the devices, it had nothing to do with what device it was. The number one predictor for where these innovative teachers said why they thought their colleagues weren't doing it was their belief. They didn't believe it. So now, let's give you one more. I'm going to arm you with data. You ready to be armed with data?
And this is a good one, by the way.
This is a really good one. And I'll actually say this. Justin's not here. So Justin Wright, some of you may have heard him yesterday in his session. He's co-founded at Tech Teacher with Tom McCord. And when we were at the iPad Summit back in Boston, and I was working really hard on this really massive research project, he brought up this study by Scott Freeman and it's another team of researchers. And I did actually look it up, and I did actually read it, because I'm like, wow, this is amazing. So, I'm so excited by statistics these days, that's where my head is. So Scott Freeman and this team of researchers, they went and they analyzed hundreds of students, college students, who were in the STEM fields. So the science, technology, engineering, math, they focused there. And they looked at hundreds of students. And then they started to do control comparisons. And they looked at those students who were in traditional sort of lecture-based classes, big universities, and those students who were engaged in more active learning. Okay? And they analyzed the performance rates. How did they do on tests? And they looked at failure rates, because at the college level, at the higher ed level, they like to fail, right? Engineering, weed out courses. And they went through all of this, and here was the significant statistic that they found. The failure rate under traditional lecturing increased by 55% over the rates that they observed under active learning. 55%. And actually, in this study, they basically said this. It is now research negligence to even think it's worthwhile to compare lecture learning and active learning. And what we really need to do is start going which active learning might work together. We have to even change the research field.
Can you even imagine arguing against something that research has said that implementing it will decrease failure rates by 55%, and yet you're going to argue against it? But yet it happens, and when I look back, what would make a person who in the face of data knows that a change can reduce failure rates by 55%, what would make them argue against it? And I come up with this, and from my own personal experience, because it's hard. Right? It's hard. That is a very powerful model that you're trying to break down and reimagine. So I'm guessing, because it's so hard, no one's ever done this before?
Well, here's what's really exciting about it. We can totally practice this. Here's what's really exciting about that, Sean. It's actually...
Who could possibly have done this impossible thing?
This is so exciting because we all actually know who has already done this impossible thing. Big Bird! Oh my gosh, I have been done. Okay, so here's confession here. I called Sean at 6 o'clock in the morning one day. So at 6 o'clock my time, it's 5 o'clock his time. I'm like, I have the answer. The answer to all of this is Big Bird.
The answer doesn't seem like it should be Big Bird.
The answer is cannot, I've had a lifelong dream to be a Muppet, and this moment right here is probably as close as I'm ever going to get. But,
I can't believe I let you do that. Okay, but anyway, go ahead. Big Bird!
so here's what happened. Let's go back and trace the history of Sesame Street. So Sesame Street didn't start with like some random street and a whole bunch of fuzzy Muppets in the middle of New York, right? And Sesame Street didn't even sit with a whole bunch of like network executives sitting around going like, what are we going to do with public television? I've got this device that's in all of these households. It wasn't about the television, and it wasn't about the street, and it wasn't about the fuzzy Muppets. Okay? They started with this need. So a whole group of educators, and reading the history of Sesame Street is actually quite fascinating, because they brought together child psychologists. They brought together children's book authors. They brought together, Jim Henson and the Muppets and the Children's Television Workshop and a whole bunch of educators out of Harvard. And they said, we have a massive crisis in this country. Children that are in high poverty areas, that are in urban areas, they're not getting the same preschool experience as what you're seeing in the more affluent areas and in the middle class areas. And they're coming in behind. So they said, hang on, we have this technology, we have public television. How can we start to increase the connection between school and home? So they started with this idea. They said, what we really want to do is we want to start to change the behavior of learning. We want students at a really early age, we want these children to start to learn what it's like to learn. We want them to start to learn how to do the alphabet. We want them to start to learn their numeracy. So they wanted their students to start to develop these new behaviors. Okay? It didn't start with a street, it didn't start with a television, it started a need. And in fact, they got to a point, and Joan Cooney-Gans, who was the lead researcher behind the whole thing, she said it came down to this. We had a belief that we wanted to foster the intellectual and the cultural development of preschoolers around the world.
So breaking it down and going back to where we began, it was about a belief that created an environment that allowed for altered and changed student behaviors.
And if we think about this too, with this example of Sesame Street, how many of you have ever seen an episode of Sesame Street? How many of you have ever learned something or actually still remember something from Sesame Street?
How many had a moment when your children watched Sesame Street and you were like, yes, I love this?
Because if we think about what made Sesame Street great, is that it was about the child. It was about how even though they were on television and the child was at home, they engaged the child in active student-centered learning. And so what we need to start thinking about with this is it's about this belief, like Sean said. It's about how a belief created that environment. And so now we need to do this. We need to start thinking about how do we make sure that our past, that our grammar of school, our thoughts about environment and behavior and beliefs, how do we make sure that that doesn't prevent us from preparing our students for the future?
So,
what did he do that for?
I didn't do that.
I love technology and stuff.
First one was me, I admit it now. But that was not. Right? And this is the part that's meaningful to you as you go off into this next day of learning and listening to other educators. It starts with you, right? The key to all of this is that you, as a teacher, have one of the most incredible powers that you create the classroom environment that your students will be in. You create the classroom environment where all of this innovation and significant change can begin. And that is something that you possess. And while it may seem so big and overwhelming, and it may have 17 years of your past experiences, nothing prevents you from making changes in small ways and big ways to alter the environment that you bring those students into every single day.
And now you have the proof to take this back to your schools, your colleagues, your administrators, so that we can make this innovation happen.
Thank you so much. We're so proud to be among you.